China, set your slaves free. Hey, Cuba.
He also was working through his Treasury Secretary to curtail the power of the Federal Reserve System. In fact, in June of 1963, he issued $6 billion in United States notes, money issued through the U.S. Treasury, not through the Federal Reserve System, which is headed by a bunch of international bankers. Johnson, as powerful as he was very much under the control of people even more powerful. For example, in his administration, he had his 16 wise men, who included Dean Rusk and McNamara, this bunch, and the banking elite of Europe, of the world. And then they came over here. They were the ones who tried to instigate the League of Nations at World War I, but we didn't want to give up our sovereignty. So then they formed the Council on Foreign Relations. Specifically with the goal of educating the American people to why we needed to be part of a United Nations. These are the globalists. These are the people that George Bush Sr. referred to as the New World Order.
New World Order. That world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations, the New World Order, will be enhanced. Our success in the goal will shape not only the New World Order we see.
Prior to Dallas, Texas, 11/22/1963, John F. Kennedy, hereafter as JFK, had defeated Richard Nixon, who had spent a lot of money attempting to become president. Instead, JFK won. Nixon must have been mad at this, and thus didn't like JFK, even though Nixon and JFK were fellow CFR members. Nixon later speaks in favor of building a new world order when he later became president and went to China and talked with the people there.
In October 1967, Richard Nixon was quoted in Foreign Affairs saying, "The developing coherence of Asian regional thinking is to evolve regional approaches to development needs and to the evolution of a new world order." A few years later, the New York Times reported that Nixon spoke of the talks as a beginning, merely reiterating the belief he brought to China that both nations share an interest in peace and building a new world order.
To build a new world order.
Nixon is alleged to have been seen at one of the Coup meetings in Dallas prior to the coup, and was in Dallas, as was also George W. Bush, who was then in the CIA, before he became ambassador to China, later CIA director under Warren Commissioner Gerald Ford, who later became vice president and later became President Ford. Skull and Bonesman's Bush then later becomes vice president, then later president, to openly promote a new world order.
New World Order. That world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations, the New World Order, will be enhanced. Our success in the goal will shape not only the New World Order we see.
Lyndon B. Johnson, connections to the oil cartels in Dallas, and an oil baron himself. He put on the later investigation commissions former JFK employee, such as former Director CIA Allen W. Dulles, CFR member too. Dulles was CFR. Prior to this, LBJ, or Lyndon B. Johnson, hereafter as LBJ, one of the most powerful Senate leaders and senators from oil baron run in Texas, with oil connections himself. With the help of his neighbor, J. Edgar Hoover, FBI director, helped blackmail the Kennedys into putting LBJ on as a running mate as vice president candidate. Hoover, as he did with many other politicians, kept files of their vices, which he then used to persuade them with, such as JFK. LBJ, thus, in being vice president candidate, was one step closer to being the president, and had to get the Kennedys out of the way in order to become president. He didn't want to wait until JFK finished his term and would have most likely did another term. He wanted to get into power before JFK's administration was over in January 1964, when JFK most likely run for another term, but in this case drop LBJ from his administration. There was even newspaper clippings of how that Nixon predicted that JFK would drop LBJ in '64 as a running mate. LBJ's past was catching up with them also concerning alleged corruption and murders, then murders to cover up the corruption. He had to take over in order to suppress investigations and to gain control over the agencies that would be doing the investigations and legal actions against him if he could. So he wouldn't go to jail.
I know as attorney for Lyndon Johnson, he murdered John Kennedy. Murdered John Kennedy to become president and to avoid prison, and there is no doubt in my mind.
In 1984, Franklin, Texas, a former Johnson business associate, Billy Celestes, appeared before a grand jury.
According to Billy Celestes, there were 8 murders perpetrated on the part of Lyndon Johnson, and the 8th name listed is the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Inspiration on the part of the Kennedys that they could get Bobby Baker to talk. Lyndon was all done. Lyndon Baines Johnson, if Robert Kennedy had his way, would not only not be on the 1964 ticket as the vice presidential candidate, but he would go to jail for the corruption that he was involved with. The Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Celestes scandal could destroy Lyndon Johnson's career. Lyndon Johnson would go to jail, and he was their man. He represented all these right-wing forces. There was an urgency to kill President Kennedy. They had to save Lyndon Johnson. The governor of Texas, first of all, is Lyndon Johnson's best friend in history. They went back decades together. In the 1948 vote scandal, John Connally was every much a part of that cover-up that took place. He was his campaign manager. It is without question John Connally who entices John F. Kennedy to Texas. Once they get him there, then they're in control of everything. Motorcade routes, the evidence, the Dallas police, everything. It's their land. It's their territory. Lyndon Johnson and his Texas cronies suckered President Kennedy to Texas. If the head of the FBI and the head of the Secret Service and key lieutenants of those two figures are involved in covering up, plus the President of the United States and all his cronies, you don't need a massive conspiracy to get away with this.
After the assassination, Cliff Carter, Johnson's aide, made repeated calls from the White House to the district attorney in Dallas, Henry Wade. He was instructed to look no further than Oswald for the guilty man. There was no conspiracy. A similar call was made to the Attorney General of Texas, Wagner Carr.
Then we have Lyndon Johnson himself calling the chief of homicide, Will Fritz, who's really doing the dirt work as far as interrogating Oswald and trying to get to the bottom of this case. He calls him and tells him, you have your man. You have your man. Let it go at that. Lyndon Johnson is trying to control what is going on with the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy from Washington, D.C., with crucial figures in the case.
From the moment he became president, Johnson had authority over every aspect of the cover-up of Kennedy's murder. He was unassailable.
Johnson has the power to contain the investigation both nationally and locally on the ground in Texas. More so than if it had happened, let's say, in Oregon or Wisconsin. Texas. He's got the power to give the CIA what it wants as president, as opposed to Kennedy, who they feared. He's got the power to take the National Security Action Memorandum that Kennedy had signed in November 1963, tear it up, reverse it, and create a war where 3 million soldiers wound up going to Vietnam instead of 16,000 being brought home by JFK. He can make J. Edgar Hoover director of the FBI for life.
Prior to 11/22/1963, JFK had been speaking of peace with the communists, wrote and worked out about helping to strengthen the United Nations. He was working on helping the civil rights movement, which must have made a lot of Ku Klux Klan in Dallas pretty angry.